Okay. So thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm HARPREET SINGH. I come to you today from my role as a regulator at the FDA, but really I wear three hats in context to this conference. I'm a geriatrician first. I've spent a lot of time in the homes of older patients, caring for them via home visits. I'm an oncologist, so I'm really passionate about the fact that there are huge knowledge gaps in the treatment of older patients with cancer as we approve tons of novel therapies with really a paucity of data in older adults. And I'm a regulator, so I direct our division of Oncology 2 within the Oncology group, and which houses several tumor types. Today, as you've heard, we are here to discuss lessons learned from COVID, which I think it's really impossible to have a conference without talking about COVID. Obviously, we're here from our homes as opposed to with each other. The FDA responded very rapidly to the pandemic and issued multiple guidances on a variety of topics, but the one that I want to talk to you mostly about today is on the conduct of clinical trials. This was really a rapid dissemination of information on how to safely continue clinical trials for registrational intent, and certainly those not for registrational intent, but this was directed at industry and investigators and IRBs. The guidance was unique in the sense that it was expedited. It was released without public comment, which is not the classic route for guidances. It was initially released on March 19th, and it's been updated several times based on frequently asked questions from industry investigators and IRBs. It was most recently updated on July 2nd. The guiding principles of the guidance is really around patient safety, that we must ensure the safety of clinical trial participants. And so while it is general, over time, it has been adapted to really incorporate really very specific advice on, for example, how you would ship an investigational therapy, or, for example, how you would obtain a verbal consent, and what are the steps that, from a regulatory perspective, would safeguard the patient, but also allow for maintaining integrity of the trial with really detailed advice. And so these are some of the general considerations for ongoing clinical trials that are within the guidance. And I'm going to take a little bit to go through each of these because they're relevant to the lessons learned from COVID and what we can take from this, really this grand experiment that we're doing to have hybrid or decentralized trials on a large scale. We've seen over the past few days that there have been several, on previous and ongoing trials that have a hybrid approach or a decentralized approach that target older adults, or where we can take lessons. But I think with COVID, what we are seeing is this rapid adaptation on a much broader scale than previously seen. So as I mentioned before, all of these considerations are to maintain and protect patients. Importantly, the investigators and sponsors should engage with their IRBs in terms of accrual and how they would administer the drug and whether patients can continue to safely participate. The guidance talks a lot about alternative off-site methods for safety assessments and site monitoring and the use of technology to facilitate data collection and monitoring. Also, how you would securely deliver investigational product, such as oral therapies, but it also talks about administration of IV therapies, which patients may be receiving on clinical trial, which could be feasible if they could not travel to their clinical trial site. And then the guidance talks a bit about whether or not, for example, COVID screening as part of routine healthcare needs to be reported as a protocol amendment. In fact, it does not, unless that data is part of the research objective or somehow changes the shape of the trial. And we also made it clear that there were protocol modifications to protect the life and well-being of patients could be implemented immediately before the IRB or FDA approval was sought. And but importantly, that all of these COVID-19 contingency measures were well documented, so that we can really take from this experience and learn and find the challenges and opportunities for inclusion of a broader group of patients. And so I took this guidance as a framework, and then I thought about many of the topics which were discussed here over the last few days around, for older adults, what has our work shown us that what are some, and these certainly are not all. For example, you'll notice I did not talk about eligibility criteria because I thought that was a bit out of scope, but what are some of the barriers to clinical trial participation that have been reported for older adults? And how could a widespread or a large scale decentralization, localization, if you will, of clinical trials impact or address some of these barriers? So one that we hear a lot about is geographic and logistical barriers. The FDA did a workshop 2017 where we had several panelists. We had on every panel, we had an industry representative, a patient advocate, an academician, and someone from the FDA. And when we talked about geographical barriers, there was a very nice map of the United States, which showed where many clinical trials are conducted, the majority, and then overlaid with where many older adults live in the United States. And obviously, you see where I'm going with this, there wasn't much overlap. And so clinical trials simply are not conducted often where older adults live. And I use rural as an example, but there are many older adults in the rural US. And then even if the clinical trial site is local, older adults often require assistance in getting to their appointments. Another barrier that has been reported in the literature is that certainly clinical trials require more healthcare interactions than standard of care. Furthermore, caregiver support is often required for transportation to and from the several appointments and for advocacy to have another ear and to help the older adult manage their medications and or side effect profile. And then something interesting that I read about recently was this desire for treatment with your home physician or community physician, that there may be in some cases a preference. And I don't necessarily think this is unique to older adults, but the study I cited there was specific to older adults having a preference for their known community-based physician. And so what are some potential silver linings that we can take from this pandemic? So I also just want to emphasize that there have been calls over several years to make clinical trials more patient-centered. They predated COVID, and FDA's efforts and support have been long-standing. The idea of decentralized trials, bringing trials to where patients live, and taking advantage of digital health technology, and also, have been discussed. And this idea that we really need to learn from real-world data has been a huge effort led by Dr. Amy Abernathy, who you'll hear about later. But older adults have been heavily impacted by COVID-19, and so we need to use real-world data to learn about this. And so, just some examples. These, for example. Some of this press, and I just wanted to highlight the fact that this quote is from January of 2019. And so again, we've been talking about this for a long time, but I think that there has been a reluctance on the part of investigators and particularly industry sponsors to widely adapt pragmatic and hybridized clinical trials, such as decentralized trials. Frankly, I think for this perhaps misinterpretation that the FDA requires X amount of visits or X, certain level of oversight, which we do. But the important part is how to conduct these decentralized trials without compromising the quality of the trial or the integrity of the data that's being collected. And that's what I think we can really learn a lot from as the data starts to come in from the decentralization of trials as a result of COVID-19. And so what are these elements that we're, again, seeing on a much broader scale now that of decentralized trials, which can address current barriers. So this idea that you can use local labs and local imaging while participating on a clinical trial, I think to a great extent may address some of the issues with logistical and geographic barriers. The use of technology, so telemedicine visits, phone and video, and also electronic patient-reported outcomes or wearables, I think can facilitate robust data collection and monitoring, perhaps even better than a clinician would be able to do in a clinical trial visit. Again, shipping oral drugs, which I've discussed, and administering IV drugs locally where possible, and obtaining remote consent to verbal or electronic, I think, having very clear guidance around that is of value. So here are some thoughts that I have for the panel, and that I hope that, will kind of come out through the course of this discussion is, how can we leverage clinical trials conducted during this pandemic and all the modifications that have been made are continuously being made to protect patient safety and as a result of COVID-19? How can we understand the implications of the remote assessments and decentralized trial procedures for older adults? What are the challenges and opportunities for utilization of telemedicine to provide care for older adults? I think there's great opportunities there, but I also want to highlight a JAMA research letter which came out a few days ago from our colleagues at UC San Francisco, highlighting perhaps some level of unreadiness in older adults given perhaps visual, hearing impairment, mild to moderate dementia, which in the absence of a caregiver may present issues in terms of really robust telehealth. And really, what are some practical lessons that we can take from the increased digitization and use of technology in clinical trials as it relates to older adults? And then what would be the next step? So would we advocate, for example, for coverage of devices that can be used that older adults could be more facile with if they have some level of impairment? Would we ask, would there be some discussion perhaps with CMS to pay, to support closed captioning, for example, on some of these devices? So I hope that these are some of the conversations we can get into later today. And I just want to thank everyone on this side, but certainly the planning committee and all of the wonderful speakers and panelists. I've been, super engaged in many of these discussions, really listening intently, and very passionate about many of the topics that are being discussed. And so thank you again for having me.